¿Ya conoces las publicaciones del Centro Olof Palme? Te invitamos a conocer el Tratado de Libre Comercio de América del Norte 2.0, bajo la autoría de 10 especialistas, coordinados por María Cristina Rosas. En esta obra aprenderás sobre regionalismo, inversión extranjera directa, agricultura y ganadería, energía, telecomunicaciones, propiedad intelectual, reglas de origen, medio ambiente, cultura y mucho más. Adquiere ya el Tratado de Libre Comercio de América del Norte 2.0. Envíanos un mensaje a través de nuestras redes sociales para adquirir esta y otras obras del Centro Olof Palme México. Contáctanos hoy mismo.
And welcome, viewers. It's great to have you for this webinar where we're going to discuss and have an in-depth discussion, I'm hoping, on what happened at last week's North American Leaders Summit. Going to be fascinated to hear the views of our three experts. Before we do that, I'm going to introduce the commentator, María Cristina Rosas from UNAM and the Olof Palme Center in Mexico City. Maria Cristina, it's great to see you again. I'm really going to enjoy this 1 hour discussion. So take it from there.
Thank you, Steve. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our guests, Payán, Kim Nossal, and Silvia Núñez for being here this morning to discuss the outcome of the 10th North American Leaders Summit that took place in Mexico City last week. So this is a very recent event. And we have seen here, at least in Mexico, many debates prior to the summit, but not after the summit. So I believe this is a tremendous opportunity to analyze the outcomes. And I should probably mention that this event is being developed by the Olof Palme Center in Mexico City in conjunction with the Rio Grande Guardian and Steve Taylor. And I really want to thank Steve for encouraging us to do this. And that said, well, I would like to introduce our guests. I will start with Tony Payán. He is director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University in Houston. Prior to that appointment, he was professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez and taught over 10 years at University of Texas in El Paso. He has a master's at Dallas University and a PhD in international relations at the University of Georgetown. He has a number of publications on matters related to Mexico-US relations, such as the book Cops, Soldiers, and Diplomats, Understanding Agency Behavior in the War on Drugs. And another book he has published is The 3 U.S.-Mexico Border Wars, Drugs, Immigration, and Homeland Security, which in fact are the 3 major issues that we face in Mexico-US relations: migration, security, and the economics also. Then I would like to move quickly to introduce Kim Nossal, a good friend from a long time. I met him back in '89, I think, when I first visited Canada. Well, Kim Nossal was born in London, but he is a Canadian citizen. He went to a school in Melbourne, Beijing, Toronto, and Hong Kong, and attended the University of Toronto, where he got his PhD in 1977. He belongs to the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. I'm joking, but I don't know if this is going to change after the passing of the Queen. Anyway, he has been appointed Professor Emeritus at Queen's University. And he's also a fellow of the Royal Society Society of Canada since 2019. He's author of a number of books on Canadian foreign policy, middle powers, the politics of Canadian foreign policy. And I remember very well a book I still read and I still have with me, which is called Rain Dancing, Sanctions in Canadian and Australian Foreign Policy. That book was published back in 1994, but you know, sanctions is now a big issue in international politics. And well, I welcome you, Kim. Thank you for being with us one more time. And now I will introduce to you Silvia Núñez. She's professor and was the head, the director of UNAM's Center for Research on North America. And she also has been a full-time researcher for decades in that institution. She did graduate work in sociology at the same university. Her career as a specialist began in research on a project on US history at the Dr. Jose Maria Luis Mora Institute, and later at the Center for Economic Research and Teaching, the CIDE, in Mexico City, in the domestic policy area of what was then the Institute of United States Studies. She has received, among other distinctions, a fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in the US. She has been recognized as an associate researcher at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Michigan State University. And she was also the head of UNAM in Los Angeles. And I should probably mention that, well, I can avoid it, I'm sorry. You know, Guillermo del Toro, the Mexican filmmaker, and you know, Pinocchio, his masterpiece. Well, he was awarded by UNAM a few months ago, prior to the release of Pinocchio. He was awarded the honoris causa doctorate by UNAM, and Silvia Núñez was there. She was delivering this award to him, so I really envy you. But apart from that, I would like to mention that Silvia has authored a number of books on Mexico and the United States relations. She has books such as Mexico in the Economic, Social, and Social Thinking of the United States. Also, she has another book called Critical Issues in the Mexico-US-Mexico Relations, Stumbling Blocks or Constructive Paths, published by CSAN at UNAM. And also, she has published other titles, What is the United States? And other important studies and articles on the issues we are discussing today. So that said, as you can see, we have three guests very prominent in the knowledge of North American studies. So I will give you back the floor, Steve, to continue from there.
Thank you so much, Maria Cristina. Fantastic introduction to these three great guests we have today. As the 10th North America Leaders Summit was held in Mexico City, I'd like to start with Silvia, if I may, and ask Silvia, what were the expectations going into this summit? And give us an overview on whether you feel those expectations were met.
Well, first of all, thank you so very much to Cristina and the Olof Palme Center for inviting me for this discussion. It is an honor to be with such knowledgeable persons that know the deep story of North America. And well, thank you for your question and for letting me the possibility to start for being like in a football match, the kick started. Your question for me is not a simple one, because what were the expectations regarding this summit? Well, it depends. I'm just going to try to focus in Mexico, because before the summit, of course, there were a lot of news going on about the relevance of this meeting. I feel very sorry that we are still talking about the meeting of the three amigos. I look forward into the future, and I really hope that I will be young enough to survive and see the performance of the three amigas coming to discuss the future and the present and the past of North America. So that is one of my first positions. The absence of more women in this event. Mexico, of course, had a very special moment, being used by the president by using this summit as a way to demonstrate his power. Let us say that the Mexican government made it finally to be approved by the security services of the United States for the Air Force No. 1 to land it in the new airport designed by this president. It is one of his most important infrastructure programs, and there was a debate on that airport. There is still a debate, but the opposition were saying, we bet that this is not going to happen. Well, it did happen. So that was one other issue that looked like a huge victory for the president. If we know that the Air Force No. 1 depart from the regular airport, that's another issue, but it made big news in Mexican media. So mediatically, it was a victory for Mexico, especially because of what happened the day before in Culiacan. So we cannot see all these things. They are linked into what was going to happen and what was expected. I think that the expectations of each leader were different in terms of what sort of message their own public opinion in Canada, in the United States, and in Mexico were looking for. So I think that when we see that also the expectations among the very small sector of specialists, where there was a lot of debate about what was going to happen, what was going what are going to be the deliverables on migration, security. But I kept looking at the media in the United States and the media in Canada, and I didn't recognize many expectations, but in terms of open public opinion about this summit, I think that it was basically, it made a lot of noise here in Mexico because it was happening here, and because, our political and economic times are in a very special, and also security is a big issue in Mexico. So I think that it is biased to say if the summit met or not the expectations. We have to see it through the deliverables that I think it will be necessary for us to say something about the joint statement, and what do we think about everything that was said in many realms. I was really surprised about the many issues that were going to be discussed, and when you see the deliverables, then we have a different story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, great points, Silvia. Thank you for kicking things off with that analysis. Let me go over now to Kim. Kim, your thoughts on what we were expecting, hoping for from the summit, and perhaps what's been achieved from a Canadian perspective.
Thank you very much. Unlike Silvia, I think that the key deliverable here was simply the meeting itself. In other words, rather than looking at what is going to come out of it, I think that one of the key expectations was that this was an opportunity for, in particular, President Biden to, in a sense, leave the 2017 to 2021 period under President Trump behind, and to be able to demonstrate not only to Americans, not only to Mexicans and Canadians, but I think far more importantly to the world, that the neighborly relationship that had been there prior to the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was back on track. And so from that perspective, for I think the Canadian side, the idea that they would participate in this opportunity for the United States to demonstrate its ability to value its friends and its neighbors, that was the most important thing. And the fact that there were so many disputes on the table between the three countries. I mean, Canada and Mexico versus the United States on autos, or sorry, Canada and Mexico versus the United States on autos, Canada and the United States versus Mexico on electricity and on Pemex, and the US and its dispute with Canada on dairy. I mean, these are significant disputes, and the fact that the summit leaders were able to give off such a positive vibe despite these differences, I think was a deliverable in itself. And so from that perspective, I think that if the expectation was to provide an opportunity for old-fashioned summit diplomacy, that was the deliverable.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. Tony, moving on to you, what were your expectations? How much were you hoping for from this? Were they met? And perhaps you can have give us a comment on that little that dig that President Lopez Obrador had towards America right at the beginning, when he said he questioned the US contribution to Latin America.
Yes, well, my expectations were never really very high for this particular summit. I think Kim said it very well. The fact that Mr. Biden has restarted the North American Leaders Summit is already an accomplishment. I think Mr. Biden has re-engaged the United States in multilateral forums in Europe, in Latin America. We saw it in November in Los Angeles. Of course, Mr. Lopez Obrador was not there in Los Angeles, and so that was a kind of a glaring absence. Later during this particular North American Leaders Summit, Mr. Lopez Obrador tried to speak on behalf of Latin America, and I think there were two mistakes on that. Number one is he's not Latin America's voice by any means. Latin America is really a very fragmented continent, and that was not the forum for that. Los Angeles was the forum for that. Mr. Lopez Obrador was not there. And the second thing is Mr. Lopez Obrador kept talking about this particular issue that you just raised, which is the United States abandonment of Latin America and the U.S. lack of engagement in Latin America. But I think Washington is not going to win this particular debate. Look, throughout Latin America, whether it is in Argentina, in Peru, in Brazil, in Venezuela, and on, there's always complaints about U.S. Intervention in Latin America and about an overbearing United States in Latin America. And Mr. Lopez Obrador has accused Washington of doing just that. And then during the summit, he turns around and says Washington has abandoned Latin America and not done right by Latin America. So I think Washington cannot win on this. If Washington adopts a very active foreign policy in Latin America, Latin Americans complain. And if Washington simply says, your problems are your problems, you solve your issues, we're not going to interfere, then you see these kinds of reproaches like the one Mr. Lopez Obrador put on the table. So clearly, Washington is simply not going to win. I think Latin America has a lot of issues that it should solve all by itself. Now, Mexico, obviously, within that context, is very particular. Now, let me say a couple of things about the expectations and what was there. Again, I repeat, I think it was quite a good thing that Mr. Biden has re-engaged the North American Leaders Summit. That is absolutely indispensable. That is important. When it comes to North America, these are not international issues. These are interdomestic issues, whether it's immigration, border management, fentanyl, trade, and you name it. Every single of these issues is really an interdomestic issue. So it has to be dealt with bilaterally. That's one thing. On the other hand, if you look at the coverage of the summit in the United States, it was largely absent. I think the LA Times had a very good article on that, but I think the New York Times, the Washington Post largely ignored it. I think most national TV chains in the United States ignore that. And when they covered it, if you look at Fox News, which is quite conservative in the United States, for example, they covered it very negatively, pretty much displacing almost many of the different issues that the U.S. is confronting today onto Mexico, not the least of which is, of course, the fentanyl crisis in the United States, the fact that Mexico has not fully and thoroughly implemented the spirit, if not the letter, of the USMCA, particularly in regard to energy and, of course, GMO corn, the agricultural. These are disputes that are coming up, of course. And I think Capitol Hill was largely absent. I was on the Hill in December, and I met with several Congress members, as I do occasionally every 3 or 4 months when I travel to Washington. I can tell you, what do they talk about? They talk about fentanyl. They talk about immigration. They talk about chaos on the border. They talk about Mexico's lack of protection of foreign investment, and on and on. It's a long list of complaints. As Silvia correctly put it, we'll see what comes of this. We'll see what follow through is done by both presidents, Mr. López Obrador and the Biden administration. I know that Mr. López Obrador is notorious for not following through on almost anything that he talks about. He's not quite good at delegating. He's not quite good at empowering people to actually solve problems. But at the end of the day, the designation of a number of individuals that are going to be in charge of all these items on the agenda, I think is hopeful. My expectations are very high, but I think it's a good thing that this particular NALS forum or summit has been restarted. That's a good beginning point, but it's just that, the beginning of a very long road ahead in what I think is going to be a very complicated 2023, and of course, an election in both countries in 2024. So we should be looking ahead.
Thank you, Tony. Silvia, is there anything you've heard there from Kim or Tony you'd like to respond to?
Well, I absolutely agree with what it has been said by Kim and Tony Payán. I would only add a couple of things. One is that the ones that are following, of course, this conversation also are the entrepreneurs in North America, and a good cause also that was raised in the summit is in relation, for example, to special support for women and Native women specifically. I think that there is in this summit we cannot deny that they have at least I don't know if this is because of promotion of the three of them, but they have a look into the future because they are raising specific issues that unfortunately there isn't clear policies to follow. One for me that is absolutely relevant in terms of bringing Canada and the United States and Mexico together is the issues that will have an impact in closing the inequality gap, the asymmetries between Mexico by itself and the United States and Canada. We know that Canada and the United States have many issues in common. One is development. I mean, the same level, no? Not in inequality, but that's another story. When we talk about inequality, for example, Mexico and the United States are doing really very poorly. I have just reviewed the information released by the OECD from the year 2022, and I found out that in terms of income inequality, Mexico is the fourth. Is the worst performance in the fourth position in income inequality, and the United States is in the seventh position. So Mexico and the United States are quite close in that matter. So anyway, what I would expect is that by focusing on these issues, as I mentioned before, and they said that they are interested in these issues of when they were talking about inclusion, but the only commitment in that matter is to share information and good practices and organizing some forums. I think that that is exactly what different actors of civic society in the three countries should open new conversations. Emerging actors in North America needs to come together to really have a look into the future. We know that if Mexico doesn't close this huge gap, we will still have migration issues going from Mexico to the United States. So I decided to start looking into little tiny spaces that were inside the discussion, but are not really as a priority. No, when you see, for example, that also Mexico, the president of Mexico said it very clearly at the end of the meeting that he was absolutely in the same position on migration with Biden. He mentioned it, but that he wanted to insist in his strategy to open the conversation to development, and then he, as he usually does, move into his own conversation to promote their specific programs in Mexico that had nothing to do with the conversation. So anyway, I think that I am also hopeful for having this space, but I think that we need to be more creative. For example, some of us who work with the students, I would like to open conversations regarding what is the present, what do they think about the present situation of their own country, and how do they see the relation with Canada and with Mexico, and if they are truly interested in coming together as a fully integrated region. I don't see that happening, but I see a lot of rhetoric coming once every now and then that we are good friends, that we are doing things together, but the impacts are not really coming to this initiative that were mentioned, that they have now a view from the bottom up. Biden even mentioned that at the end of the meeting. So I have mixed feelings regarding who has the right to promote a vision for the future. I believe this cannot be trapped by political parties and political election. I mean, every time we have different politicians, they have new ideas, but we are in a great need of having new conversations being open by third actors that are not only the governments and business community.
Thank you, Silvia. I'd like to move on to border security now. as we know, President Biden, before going down to Mexico City for the summit, paid his first visit to the US-Mexico border. He went to El Paso, announced a few small changes, but for sure, really, everything stays the same in terms of the Remain in Mexico policy. Silvia, very quickly, back to you. What was the reaction? What is the reaction in Mexico to the US a policy on border security, and how big a deal is it? And were those changes well received?
Again, for me, sorry.
Sorry, border security.
Yeah.
Did you? Yeah, Biden
okay.
goes down. Yeah, Biden visits El Paso and makes a few small changes, but the Remaining Mexico policy, the courts have decided stays in place.
Well, I think that the perception here is we have still mixed feelings because the experience of border communities on the side of Mexico is still a very problematic one by receiving all these deportees coming to Mexican urban areas. There is, of course, and we should be very worried about it, some nativist attitudes in those specific areas. And I know that the president of Mexico mentioned that he was so grateful to Biden that he didn't follow on the building up of the wall. But Biden said very clearly that, and we know it because he made this specific stop in El Paso. Tony and myself, we have a personal and family relation to El Paso, and we know how El Paso is. And there were some complaints in the US media regarding why Biden didn't go to a detention center, for example, along the hours that he was in El Paso. No? So anyway, we in Mexico, we have no good expectations regarding what is going to happen because the message sent from the White House before coming to Mexico was of it is to securitize much more the U.S. border, not only to protect the United States for whatever drug smuggling, but also to prevent more aliens trying to come into the United States. When Biden says that, and AMLO celebrates that now there is at least one program of 30,000 coming from Nicaragua, Venezuela, we should ask ourselves many questions. But one of them is, have you ever heard how difficult it is to get a passport in Haiti, in Cuba, and Venezuela, Nicaragua? It is almost an impossible dream. It's not only expensive, there is corruption, and they need a passport. So the first step for them is not only to have a sponsor, but also to have a passport. Who are the ones who are going to be able to have those passports to make it orderly, an orderly and legal arrival into a U.S. airport? That is something that needs to be discussed.
Thank you so much. Let me bring Tony into this. Tony, your take on the border security situation, U.S. and Mexico.
Yes, Silvia is correct. I happen to hail from the border, El Paso, Juarez area, and I happen to be there over the Christmas break. That's where my family is, and I spend the holidays there. And I was there during the the visit by President Biden. Look, there's a couple of issues here that I think are important. I think the immigration issue is a problem. When I stood on the Juarez side and you look at the riverbed and you look at all these immigrants camping, all these different tents all along the border, and then you look at the National Guard in Texas, and they're deploying train containers, and they're deploying barbed wire, and they're deploying horses and armor vehicles, and I mean and then you go into downtown El Paso, especially around Sacred Heart Parish. And by the way, this has happened in San Diego, this has happened in Nogales, this has happened in Del Rio, Texas, this has happened in South Texas. So it's not a unique situation. This time it was El Paso's turn. And you go to El Paso, downtown El Paso, around Sacred Heart Parish, and then you see hundreds, thousands of immigrants milling around, sleeping on the sidewalks. It was, I took pictures of it. I visited, I spoke with some of the immigrants. I saw a woman clinging onto a bus looking for a little bit of heat from the bus motor. The situation was chaotic. That is not going to add to the political solution of this problem. Communities on the border are overwhelmed, not just Mexican communities. American communities are too overwhelmed by these thousands, hundreds of thousands of immigrants during the 22 fiscal year, which ended on October 1st. September 30th, we had 2.8 million encounters on the U.S.-Mexico border. If you think about compensating 20 or 30, even 40% double takes, meaning individuals that have tried once or two, three, four times. So even if you reduce a percentage because of the number of individuals, or at least count the number of individuals, not the number of encounters, you're still talking about 2 million people coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, transiting through Mexico. I think the López Obrador administration is using the immigration card against the United States. It is very obvious that they've played that card for a very long time, and it has not paid off. Let me tell you, 2019, 2020, 2021, 22, and now 23, the numbers are extremely high. If the strategy laid out by the Trump administration and the López Obrador administration, and now by the Biden administration and the López Obrador administration in the last 2 years, were actually paying off, we would not be seeing these numbers. The numbers belie the failure of the strategy. Now, this is obviously a regional issue, and this is one of the things that I think Mr. López Obrador tried to address, but also he does it from the wrong pulpit. Why do I say that? It is true. Look, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti are failing states. They're not only failing within, they're failing their own people. Venezuela, for example, which had 35 million people before Venezuelans began to leave that country, is now at 26 million people. That country is hemorrhaging people. Cuba last year lost 2.5% of its population. They're leaving that island. All these states are actually failing states, if not already failed states. And Mexico is doing absolutely nothing to contribute to stopping those immigrants and forcing those countries to actually do something about the situation. In fact, Mr. López Obrador has been quite generous with them and has even praised them. Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. He considers himself a personal friend of these leaders who are failing their people. And so Mr. López Obrador has been playing that card so that he can get away with other issues, not implementing the USMCA as it is supposed to be implemented, not opening the energy sector, and on and on. Now, the point about the wrong pulpit and why I think Mr. López Obrador is the wrong person to preach about that. Look, he made a point that the United States ought to be investing more money, tens of millions of dollars. And Mr. Biden said, look, we've thrown money at Latin America in the tens of millions of dollars, right? And we need to develop these countries, Mr. López Obrador said. He is correct, but I am yet to know of a single country that has developed on the back of social programs. I'm yet to know of a country that has broken into the middle class by virtue of government investment. Government plays a role. But the most important role is to allow the markets do what they do best: invest, create development, create employment, and on and on. That's what those countries refuse to do. And I think Mr. López Obrador is also failing Mexico. Look, if you talk about the triangle, China, the United States, and Mexico, Mexico is ideally geographically positioned to take advantage of all the reshoring, friendshoring, nearshoring, and all that lingo that's being kind of floating around academics and things like that. Yes, but not if the right conditions on investment protection, business certainty, or a good business environment, and of course the right policies, which means robust regulatory apparatus and non-interference by the government beyond effective regulation of the market, then Mexico is wasting that opportunity. We see that is what happened in Cuba. That's what happened in Nicaragua. That's what happened in Venezuela. And Mr. López Obrador favors those kinds of policies. He really believes that by sheer government action, development can be created. That is not the historical experience of anyone. That is well known in the United States. And I think Mr. Biden answered that, or at least he tried to answer very clearly. So there are some really serious issues here. What I want to rescue from this is that what we need is a narrative. What we need, you may remember in the 1990s, there was a lot of talk about North America, a competitive continental platform, vis-a-vis Asia, vis-a-vis Europe. There was that narrative, and everybody kind of moved around that narrative. There was a gravitational pull by the narrative. We didn't get that narrative from this North American Leaders Summit. We still need to build that narrative. It's going to take time, but obviously we are engaged in this kind of belly button contemplation, everybody with all kinds of issues, small issues and problems and things like that. And we're not building that narrative that then is going to give sense and coherence to North America, which is what we should be driving towards. So there's a lot of work to be done still, but I'm afraid that 23 and 24 are probably not the years to build that narrative.
Kim, I'd like to move over to you now, and to if there's anything you want to add on the topic of border security, please do go ahead and do so. But if not, I've got a question about trade for you.
Okay, let me just follow on Tony's and Silvia's observations here, just to remind our audience that for Canada, this issue of border security on the southern border of the United States is essentially a non-issue. It ranks exceedingly low in the priorities of the government in Ottawa. Canada could have done so much more in the context of trying to address some of the root causes of this large migration of human beings, and essentially it has chosen not to. And in part, I think that this is a function of the fact that, as Tony quite rightly says, we're focusing, each of the partners are focusing on their own rather small and very narrow interests, rather than conceptualizing North America as a broader region. I think that, Tony, you're correct when you talk about the narrative from the 1990s, but even then, when I think about how that narrative really failed to be embraced by Canadians and Americans in particular, is a nice reminder of the difficulty of creating regional narratives. The fact that, and I was thinking as you were talking, the fact that the members of Congress that you talked to had the kind of positions that they did, the views that they did, the preferences and priorities that they had, not one of them focused on the notion of North America. And I think that is one of the considerable difficulties. In terms of, so, okay, let me stop there, and I can address the issue of trade.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about.
I'd like, Steve, if I may, I'd like to add something about Canada. Obviously, that is an important country. My sense in the North American Leaders Summit is that they were, to some extent, all three, by the way, talking past each other. They're not they were not quite in conversation. Sometimes you had the impression that they were addressing different issues at different times, each of them rushing to put in their point, to make their point, rather than actually listening carefully and then responding carefully. And what I noticed is that there really are several bilateral relationships. Canada and the United States have some issues with Mexico. Mexico and Canada have some issues with the United States. And of course, Canada and the United States have some issues with Mexico. So clearly there were several conversations going on. It was several tracks at the same time and several issues, and everybody was trying to pack in their points. And I think that was, to me, that is not a successful conversation. So in some ways that was a problem.
Great, thank you, Tony. So let's go back to Kim. What happened at the summit regarding trade? I was struck by those remarks at the end by López Obrador when he said that the three countries have agreed to set up a task force. They're going to have 4 members from each country. He named some heavyweights. I don't know who the US and Canadian representatives will be, but how important will that task force be? And what came out of the summit in general? On that task force, by the way, is supposed to be about economic competition. But what was discussed, what was important, what was important coming out of that summit on trade?
So I think that the key here is the mechanism that the 3 leaders chose to try and address the core problem which Tony has identified, and that is that what you have in these 3 leaders are individuals who have very different issues on economic development and trade. Let's face it, Joe Biden, while it is great that he is beginning to reverse some of the aspects of the Trump administration in terms of American friends and allies, the fact is that Joe Biden is a deeply protectionist president, and he is at the head of a party that remains protectionist. And we have to keep in mind that the other party in the United States has turned deeply protectionist as well. And so what we have is a protectionist administration, a protectionist Congress. Mr. López Obrador is also, in his own way, an economic nationalist, and has a particular view about the relationship between the state and the economy and the private sector. Mr. Trudeau himself has a different kind of perspective. He is not protectionist, except, of course, in matters where it suits his political party to be protectionist, as in the case of protecting the dairy industry. He tends to be, even though Canada has lined up with the United States on the question of opening the market to electricity and fossil fuels. The fact is that as a number of people have noted in Canada, Mr. Trudeau isn't terribly comfortable arguing in favor of multinational energy corporations. And so what we have here, it seems to me, are 3 leaders with very different views. And I think that the appointment of a task force, which will essentially download to a tri-national group, an attempt to try and get around these problems, is a smart move. Whether or not, and here I agree with where Silvia began our conversation today, we'll have to see whether or not this task force will be able to produce the deliverables of actually addressing the incompatibilities of Canadian, Mexican, and American views on these trade and investment matters. And as both Silvia and Tony have mentioned, the fact is that we're facing elections in 2024, and in the United States, the possibility that we will have a return to an America First president, a Republican, whether Mr. Trump or another Trump-like president, means that the possibility that the relationship will be thrown back to where it was after 2017 remains a significant challenge for all three countries.
Thank you. Silvia and Tony.
Steve,
I want to give you...
if I may,
Yeah.
I just have a couple of comments and a question for Kim and probably the other participants. Kim, I'm very curious about something Tony mentioned earlier. He said that this summit had very little coverage in the media in the US. In Mexico, it got a wide coverage. We had this summit cover everywhere. We had pictures of the participants, their wives, and in all possible circumstances cover. But how was in Canada? Was the summit important to Canada media? And also this leads me to another question for the three of you. It's been said that this summit was somehow dealing mostly with migration due to the importance of this agenda between Mexico and the US, and that other issues were overshadowed. And one of the issues that it's been mentioned in media all over the world, I just saw an article published in the New York Times, suggests that migration is overshadowing the situation of eroding democracy in Mexico. So I'm curious about your comments on this. But Kim, how was this summit covered?
More than in the United States, less than in Mexico. It was seen as important, but once again, Canadian priorities were reflected in how the media tended to cover it, which was essentially to focus on Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Biden rather than on the three leaders themselves. So from that point of view, yes, the leader summit was regarded as important in large measure because of its signaling purposes for the world, but it wasn't as central as, of course, it would be had the Leaders Summit occurred in Ottawa rather than Mexico City.
Silvia and Tony, just a couple, 2 or 3 minutes each on trade issues, if you wish. Silvia.
Well, I think that as Cristina is mentioning, migration was a key priority being discussed, basically among the United States and Mexico. Of course, López Obrador say thank you so much to Canada because we have this program enforced with Canada, and in fact he said the Mexican workers in Canada are not being harassed. Well, I mean that is a way to say it, but I have colleagues who have been devoted their life to precisely to discuss what is really happening to migrants in Canada, working in the labor camps. And so in terms of economics, I think that the three countries are truly worried about their own economic situation, and they truly believe that coming together and stronger, it needs to be done. No, that this is the reason why they are focusing on a new way of coming together. But there is a question on my side regarding what López Obrador said. He said that the 12 experts, and he mentioned the 4 experts that are coming to participate, starting with someone that we all know, that is running for the presidency. And he's supposed to be the lead, and needs to leave the office in, I don't know, in March, pretty soon. So he cannot be the leader, Marcelo Ebrard, of this task force, because he is, in fact, already involved in his own political future. So that was, for me, a huge mistake. So I have not really heard what is going on with this new task force in the side of the United States and the side of Canada, but I truly believe that they must be interested in deepening in some ways and solve, for example, the issue of energy, which I don't know how is it going to be solved on the side of the relation with Mexico, but they know that if they don't do something, the three countries are going to lose ground in the international scenario. And just to finish this, I have to highlight something that created, for my perspective, a big problem for Biden. When these journalists bring out the situation of the Biden pen papers. No, we know that the US president, so I don't see the summit as a victory for Biden, because he was exposed. Mexicans didn't understand really much what was that about, but Biden knew that he's going to be back in Washington with another storm on his shoulders. And in that case, I think that the similarities of the political situation in terms of the job approval of Canadian, of Trudeau and Biden are very similar, with a huge gap between the popularity of the Mexican president that is beyond the 60%. So that is exactly what they also were, trying to move around while the three of them were here together. So they have very different perspectives about their personal political future.
Thank you. Tony, your thoughts on the trade situation?
Let me begin to think about what you said. Look, partnerships are built on common interests, common narratives, and common identities. That's key. So where are the three North American nations in regards to narrative, identity, and interests? They seem to be going in completely different directions. For example, on the narrative, it's simply not there. And clearly, Mexico has chosen to side with Latin American dictators and even express a certain degree of sympathy for Russia in the Russia-Ukrainian war. That completely puts Mexico on a different foothold, on a different setting than Canada and the United States, which are making their best effort to aid Ukraine given the invasion of Russia. So that clearly means something. It spills over into Latin America, it spills over into the Caribbean, even if it comes from Russia and the Ukraine and on and on. The other thing is common interests. Like Kim said, Canada is the advocate for open markets, for regional integration and such, but Canada is a small country. It's a relatively small country. At the end of the day, Mexico and Canada cannot avoid the gravitational pull of the United States. If the United States doesn't lead, it's going to be very difficult for Ottawa or Mexico City to actually lead. So that has to come out of Washington. That's number one, and it's not coming. Number three, identity. Look, Mexico is drifting. There is clearly an important backsliding when it comes to democratic institutions and the rule of law in Mexico. That's been very clear in the United States. We don't see eye to eye. Mexico expelled DEA agents and has refused to collaborate deeply and seriously with the United States on issues of drug trafficking, immigration, and the rule of law, despite the rhetoric. So clearly, they're on a different wavelength, and that doesn't make these disparate interests identities, and of course, the absence of a narrative make it very difficult for these leaders to accomplish something. That, despite the fact that we have to acknowledge that Mr. Biden took the lead and restarted the North American Leaders Summit, and that's an important step. We shouldn't expect a whole lot of one meeting. Now, the other thing that I want to mention here is, look, popularity. I disagree somewhat with the point of popularity. Look, Joe Biden has not been a very popular president. His approval ratings have been in the 30s or even 40s, and yet he has been a very effective president in the United States. He's been able to push a lot of legislation. He's been able to put the United States back on the international stage. He's been able to restart the multilateralism venues that the United States had pursued before the Trump administration, and on and on. I think Biden is an underestimated president. And I think Trudeau has done good by Canada. I'll leave Kim to make an assessment of how much good Trudeau has done, or how good he has been for Canada. And in Mexico, yeah, the president may have a 55% approval rating, but it's a failure of an administration. It's a failure on security. It's a failure on immigration. It's a failure on economic growth. It's a failure everywhere. So to me, popularity is not equivalent to success. It's not equivalent to governing well. It's not equivalent to accomplishing anything, because here we have three leaders that enjoy very different degrees of popularity and have very different degrees of success. One more thing about trade. Look, Mr. López Obrador's wishes, in my view, from the very beginning, much like Trump, was to essentially ditch the North American Free Trade Agreement. That would have been his ideal scenario, and to recenter the Mexican economy in a kind of a state-led model. He wasn't able to do that, not only because some of the institutions in Mexico resisted, but because the interests that the private sector and the Mexican and American societies had built in were so strong that the consequences would have been so negative that Mr. López Obrador would have taken Mexico down a tailspin of complete chaos and uncertainty. So he wasn't able to undo it. So how do we build from that? But by the way, when it comes to the USMCA and the North American Free Trade Agreement, the USMCA is a much better agreement than NAFTA was. NAFTA may have been very good for 1994, but it certainly needed some updating. It needed modernization, and I think it was accomplished. Whatever the reasons for Mr. Trump to actually call NAFTA into question, whatever the reasons to re-engage negotiating NAFTA, the USMCA turned out to be a much better agreement. It has certain advantages. For example, in 2026, and we shouldn't forget that, the USMCA is up for its first revision and review. This will be an opportunity again to modernize the agreement again. Are we ready for that? What are we going to do about the sunset clause in the USMCA? Are we going to use that to continue to advance labor market integration? There is a labor chapter in the USMCA. Are we going to advance that for intellectual property, for integration of other industries, the semiconductors, which was mentioned in the North American Leaders Summit, and on and on. So this allows an opportunity to continuously modernize the relationship and to continuously frame it legally through an agreement every 6 years that we have to be reviewing this particular agreement. So there's a lot of opportunities up ahead as well. I don't think Mr. López Obrador is the one to do it. He doesn't have the imagination, he doesn't have the leadership, he doesn't have the creativity, he doesn't have anything, and he's on his way out. He's got 1.5 years left. I think he finishes on September 30th, I think. So and the elections are in June. So the clock is ticking. So we ought to be looking to the next administration, both in Mexico and the United States, possibly in the United States, I'm not sure, to look at 2026 as the next opportunity to update, to reset the relationship. And that's the importance of restarting the NALS, the Leadership Summit. That is key. As long as it's going, the opportunity will come to do it right again, even if it's not 23 or 24.
Thank you, Tony. I know I've got to hand it back to Maria Cristina in just a moment, but super quick. Kim, the state of Canadian-Mexico relations before we close.
The relationship remains fairly distant. Some of the difficulties of a decade ago have been resolved. But essentially, Mexico remains very low on the priority list for governments in Ottawa and the Trudeau government in particular. And so from that point of view, one can be hopeful that one of the consequences of the positive consequences of the restarting of this North American Leaders Summit will be to push Mexico, relations with Mexico, a little higher up the priority list in Ottawa.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, all three of you, for a fascinating, absorbing discussion. Maria Cristina, any closing remarks?
Yes, I want to thank the participants for providing their views on the summit of the North American leaders. I have some final remarks. First of all, by listening to you, I believe that we can agree on the fact that it was good that this meeting happened, especially considering that during the Trump administration years, these meetings didn't happen. Trump favored bilateral relations, favor relations with Mexico and relations with Canada, but avoid even relations between Mexico and Canada. And I believe we are still suffering from the consequences of that interruption. I would like to remind you also the way these meetings started. They started in the context of the 9/11 attacks. They started in 2005 on the grounds of the smart borders issues. And then we started to have these meetings, not every year. There have been interruptions, as you know, and the the worst interruption was during the Trump years, but still it's good that we have these meetings. That said, I believe in these meetings we have different issues addressed and different priorities addressed, but still we are seeing different meetings. One priority is the US-Mexican meeting and agenda. Another one is the US-Canada agenda. And finally, and very distant from that, we have the Canada-Mexico agenda. And I agree with Kim, Mexico should be higher in the priorities of the foreign policies of the US and Canada. And well, that said, I believe we have not been able to develop a sense of a North American community. Prior to this summit, I was invited by a Spanish university to address the possible outcomes of this North American summit. And I was asked from a Spanish student about the way North American relations have been developing under NAFTA and now under the USMCA. And he asked this question by thinking about the way the European community developed. And I had to clarify him that we are not creating a sort of North American community the way the European community is. We have intergovernmental relations mostly. We don't have supranational entities to address the issues of interest. So we are very far still from creating a North American community. It seems it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of political will. So let's wait and see what happens in the next North American Leaders Summit. And I thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So I guess this is it. And well, hope to see you again. Hope to share, to have the opportunity to share your views with our audience in a possible next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Kim, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Sylvia.
Thank you.
And thank you, Cristina, for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. A pleasure having you. And
I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Enjoy this year. Happy 2023. Take care.
Thanks so much.